The cafe smelled faintly of roasted coffee and fresh bread, a warm sanctuary from the snow that fell relentlessly outside, coating the city in a soft white silence. Inside, Daniel Hayes sat alone at his usual corner table, staring through the frosted window with a blank, faraway expression. The steam rising from his cup curled upward and disappeared, much like the life he once knew, quiet, gone, and impossible to hold on to. For Daniel, a successful architect who had spent his career designing spaces where people could live, laugh, and gather, silence had become his closest companion. It had been 2 winters since his wife's car never made it past that intersection. 2 winters since the phone call that hollowed him out completely. 2 winters of mornings that felt identical, gray, heavy, and too long. He came to this cafe every day not because the coffee was exceptional, but because sitting among strangers was easier than sitting alone in a house that still smelled like her. He wasn't looking for anything. He wasn't hoping for anything. He had quietly stopped doing both. But today, the silence was broken by a small voice. Daniel looked up from his cup to see a woman stepping through the cafe door clutching a 3-year-old boy against her chest. The little boy's eyes were heavy with exhaustion, drooping with the kind of tiredness that goes beyond a mist nap. His cheeks were flushed pink from the cold, and he buried his face into his mother's shoulder as though trying to disappear into her warmth. The woman scanned the cafe quickly, the way people do when they're trying to seem composed but are actually calculating every single thing. Every empty seat, every judging glance, every dollar they do or don't have. She found a table nearby and sat down carefully, settling the boy into the chair beside her. Daniel watched without meaning to, and then he noticed something that cut straight through the numbness he had been living inside for 2 years. The boy was wearing mismatched mittens. One was thick and gray, clearly warm and well-made. The other was thin and brown, a size too small, barely covering his little fingers. It was such a small detail, such an ordinary, unremarkable thing. But for reasons Daniel couldn't immediately explain, he couldn't look away from those 2 mismatched mittens. The woman, he would later learn, was named Grace Mitchell. She looked to be in her late 20s, though the dark circles under her eyes and the tension held permanently in her jaw made her seem much older. She had the kind of face that must have been soft and open once, before life began pressing down on it. She didn't look at the menu. She flagged down the waitress and, in a voice barely above a whisper, asked only for a cup of warm water. Not tea, not coffee. Warm water. Daniel understood that language. It was the language of someone who was counting every coin, who had learned to calculate warmth against cost and chosen warmth. He watched her wrap both hands around the cup and hold it in front of her son's face, letting the steam rise toward his little nose. The boy, Lucas, stopped shivering slowly. Daniel looked down at his own plate, a croissant he had ordered out of habit and had no real intention of eating. And then he looked back at Lucas, who had turned his eyes toward that croissant with an expression no child should ever wear. It wasn't begging, it wasn't dramatic. It was simply hunger, plain and quiet and honest, the way children show things before the world teaches them to hide it. Grace's coat was worn thin at the elbows. The cuffs were frayed from too many winters passing through them. She sat with perfect posture, as though good posture was the one thing she could still control, and she kept her eyes slightly down, not out of shame exactly, but out of that particular kind of pride that refuses to let anyone see how close to the edge you are standing. It didn't take an architect, a man trained to see the structural truth beneath every surface, to understand that this woman and her son had been walking for hours, that the cafe was not a destination but a refuge, that the warm water was not a preference but a necessity. Daniel felt something shift in his chest. Not dramatically, not like a revelation, more like a door long rusted shut, creaking open just a fraction. He thought about his own worst nights. The nights after the accident, when he had sat in the kitchen at 3 a.m, not knowing if the morning would ever feel worth reaching. The nights he had held on not because he was strong, but simply because letting go required a decision he couldn't make. He recognized something in Grace's stillness, the particular stillness of someone who is fighting very hard and making it look like nothing at all. He couldn't stay silent without overthinking it, because overthinking it would have meant talking himself out of it. Daniel pushed his plate across the narrow distance between their tables. He caught the waitress's eye and nodded toward Grace and Lucas. "Hot soup," he said quietly. "Whatever's warm." Then he looked at Grace, who had gone rigid with a combination of surprise and something very close to defensive pride, and he said simply, gently, "If you sit, you have to eat too." It was not pity in his voice. It was something much older and simpler than pity. It was recognition. Grace looked at him for a long moment. Lucas had already reached for the croissant with both mismatched mittened hands, and the pure, uncomplicated joy on his face as he bit into it made the entire cafe feel, just for a second, like a sacred place. Grace's pride began to thaw slowly the way ice does, not all at once, but from the edges inward. She whispered a thank you, and then, because Daniel was listening in a way that people rarely listen, fully without waiting for his turn to speak, she began to talk. Not in a torrent of desperation, but carefully, the way someone speaks when they are choosing which truths to trust a stranger with. She had lost her job several weeks ago. Her landlord had given her until the end of the week. There was no money left. There was no family nearby. There was only Lucas, and the fact that she would not let him feel the full weight of what was happening. Daniel listened. He asked no dramatic questions. He offered no sweeping solutions. He simply listened, and occasionally, between sips of coffee, said something small and true. He saw in her the same quiet, unbreakable determination that had kept him breathing on his own worst mornings. Grace wasn't asking for rescue. She wasn't performing her suffering for sympathy. She was simply, exhaustedly trying to find the next foothold. And Daniel, who had spent 2 years feeling like he had nothing left to offer anyone, found himself saying something he hadn't planned. "I'm not trying to fix your life," he told her. "I just don't want you to fight alone." He offered her a job. His home, a large and beautiful house that he had designed himself and now moved through like a ghost, needed maintaining. He had let things slide. The dust accumulating on shelves that used to hold photographs he couldn't look at, the garden going untended, the rooms standing empty and airless. He needed help, and if she needed work, perhaps they could help each other. Grace hesitated. Her hands trembled slightly around her cup. She looked at Lucas, who had fallen softly asleep against her arm, full and warm for the first time in days, and she said yes. What happened over the following weeks was not a fairy tale. It was something quieter and more real than that. Grace came each day and brought order back to spaces that had forgotten what order felt like. She cooked simple meals, nothing elaborate but warm and real, filling the kitchen with smells that Daniel hadn't realized he had been missing. Lucas played on the living room rug with blocks, narrating his constructions in the serious, businesslike tone of a 3-year-old who has decided that building things is the most important work in the world. Daniel sometimes stood in the doorway and watched him and felt something he couldn't quite name. Not happiness exactly, but the faint, fragile beginning of it. Grace sang softly while she worked. Not loudly, not performatively, just quietly to herself, the way people do when they forget they are not alone. Daniel heard it from his study and found that he did not mind. Found, in fact, that he had been waiting for a sound like that without knowing it. For the first time since losing his wife, the house had a heartbeat again. It wasn't the same heartbeat. It wasn't the life he had lost and would never stop missing, but it was life. Warm, imperfect present life. One evening, when the winter sun was setting low and painting the living room in long golden strips of light, Daniel sat in the armchair by the window watching Lucas play. The boy was still wearing those mismatched mittens. He had become somewhat attached to them, refusing the newer ones Daniel had quietly placed in the drawer for him. Grace was in the kitchen finishing the dishes, the sound of running water and her soft humming drifting through the house. And Daniel finally asked the question that had been living in the back of his mind since that very first morning in the cafe. "Grace," he called. She appeared in the doorway, drying her hands. "I've always wondered," he said, choosing his words carefully, "the mismatched mittens. Did Lucas lose the others in the snow somewhere?" Grace went still. It was a particular kind of stillness. Not the composed stillness of someone in control, but the stillness of someone suddenly standing in the middle of a memory they carry very carefully. Her hands stopped moving. Her eyes filled with something raw and unguarded, the kind of expression that appears when someone asks the exact right question at the exact right time. She told him the truth. The night before they had walked into that cafe, the night before they had met Daniel, Grace and Lucas had been staying in an overcrowded emergency shelter. It had been standing room only, cold despite the bodies packed into it, smelling of wet coats and exhaustion. Grace had 2 pairs of matching mittens for Lucas, both in good condition, both warm. And in the corner of that shelter, she had seen 2 small children, a little girl and her younger brother, huddled together with their hands tucked under their arms because they had nothing. Their fingers were red from the cold. They were too young to understand why they were there. They were simply cold and trying not to be. Grace had no extra money. She had no spare coat, no blanket to offer. She had almost nothing. But she had 2 pairs of mittens, and Lucas needed only 1. So without saying a word to anyone, she had taken 1 gray mitten from Lucas's matching pair and given it to the little girl. She had taken 1 brown mitten from his other pair and given it to the boy. She had left Lucas with the 2 odd ones, the thick gray and the thin brown, and she had told him they were special. That mismatched things were actually the best kind, and he had believed her completely because he was 3 years old, and she was his mother, and he believed everything she said. She had been skipping her own meals to stretch what little they had. She had been walking instead of taking buses to save every coin. She had been calculating and sacrificing and holding on by the thinnest of threads. And in the middle of all of that, she had still looked into the corner of a cold room and given away the very last warmth she had to offer so that 2 other children wouldn't have to suffer. Daniel sat in his golden-lit armchair and said nothing for a long time. He had spent 2 years believing that the world was a place that took things from you. That loss was the fundamental truth of being alive, and everything else was just distraction from it. He had closed himself off not out of cruelty, but out of a kind of exhausted self-protection, the way you stop opening windows in winter because you already know how cold the air is. But Grace Mitchell had walked into a shelter with almost nothing, and she had still found something to give. She had arrived at his cafe with a sleeping child and mismatched mittens and a quiet, iron-spined refusal to let the cold world make her cold. And she hadn't told anyone. She hadn't needed anyone to see it. She had just done it, the way people do the most important things, in the dark, alone, without applause. Daniel understood then that he hadn't saved a struggling mother and her child that snowy morning. He had been sitting in that cafe for 2 years, hollowed out and waiting, and Grace and Lucas had walked in and, without knowing it, without trying, had given him something back. Not his grief, not his past, but the quiet, essential belief that goodness was still real. So, that people still chose warmth over nothing. That life was still worth leaning toward. He hadn't found them. They had found him. There are people who walk into your life not because you went looking, but because something larger and more patient than either of you arranged the morning just right. A snowstorm, a corner table, a croissant on a plate, 2 mismatched mittens on a little boy's hands. The smallest details carry the biggest truths if you are paying attention. For Daniel Hayes, an architect who had spent his career building structures meant to last, finally understood that the most enduring things we build are not made of steel or concrete or glass. They are made of the choices we make when we have almost nothing left. The choice to give anyway, to stay open anyway, to believe in the person sitting across from you anyway. Grace had taught him that. Lucas, in his mismatched mittens, had shown him that. And the house, which had been silent for 2 long winters, was quiet no more. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you that goodness is still alive and still choosing itself in the cold corners of the world, please take a moment right now to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. There is someone in your life who is holding on quietly, who is fighting a battle they haven't told you about, and this story might be exactly the thing they need to feel less alone. Subscribe to Pure Kindness and join a community that believes in the extraordinary power of ordinary compassion. And in the comments below, we want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed a quiet act of sacrifice that completely changed the way you see the world? A moment where someone gave what they couldn't afford to give simply because they couldn't bear not to? Share your story. Keep the chain going. Because humanity stays alive not in grand gestures, but in small ones. In warm soup pushed across a table, in a mitten given to a stranger's cold hand, in a door open just wide enough to let the light back in. One story at a time, one act of kindness at a time, we keep each other warm.